Though some of them were inadequately addressed, Pt.2 tackled several matters at the very heart of the Paris Agreement and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The Paris Agreement has introduced a bottom-up approach of emission reduction by inviting countries to submit nationally determined contributions stating their respective emissions mitigation targets. NDCs must be prepared and submitted to the United Nations every 5 years, and each successive NDC must progress beyond the previous one.
Post-Paris, we have an obligation to do everything we can to keep global warming well below 2 degrees and pursue efforts to keep it to 1.5 degrees. And that means getting out of all fossil fuels and into 100% renewables. And it means that everyone will need to come up with a plan how to get there in a relatively short time span by mid-century. So it's extremely useful not only for national governments, but for subnational governments, for companies, for cities, to develop these kinds of plans and to prepare for the low-carbon future.
As of now, indicative NDCs have already been submitted by most countries and are placed in an interim registry. Once the Paris Agreement is implemented, NDCs will be recorded in a public registry. NDCs vary from country to country in terms of schedules and baselines, with a view to integrate NDCs in national policies and investment plans and correctly assess mitigation efforts.
Plans are important mainly for 3 reasons, I would say. One, they connect the long and the short-term obligations. We have these very ambitious long-term obligations that come from the Paris Agreement. We need to achieve, as the Paris Agreement highlights, net carbon neutrality, greenhouse gas emissions neutrality, actually, in the second half of the century. And we want to keep global warming, if possible, to 1.5 degrees, and certainly well below 2. These long-term obligations, you have to develop scenarios, essentially, how to get there. I mean, this is very ambitious, and it's very urgent. So you need to know where you want to be in 2050, and then you can plan backwards and see where you have to be in 2030. And once you know where you have to be in 2030 or 2025, that actually has implications today. So an example from my country, the power sector targets that we see in Germany's 2050 plan, broken down power sector targets for 2030, mean, even if the plan doesn't say that explicitly, they mean that Germany has to get out of coal relatively rapidly. So what's in these plans has implications for the short term, has implications for today. Achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement will mean decarbonization, rapid decarbonization, and that means we have to think about the regions and workers that currently rely on fossil fuels, because we have to develop alternatives and just transition plans for them. And finally, the third argument is that, of course, these plans are crucially important to provide an investment roadmap for companies and investors to know which sectors will grow and thrive in the future low-carbon economy and which investments are becoming more and more risky, and where divestment is needed to get out of fossil fuels, where there's only very limited space for continued fossil fuel use, and therefore those are becoming risky investments. And giving these clear signals to investors in these plans is the third important element that I would highlight.
Still will need a lot of time.
At Marrakech, countries discussed the need for a method to develop further guidance on NDCs, such as a uniform set of guidelines to facilitate transparency, clarity, and understanding, as well as appropriate accounting procedures for emissions and their removal. Negotiations on NDCs, however, were slow and contested. Developed countries wanted the NDC registry to focus only on mitigation, whereas developing countries wanted to include adaptation goals and financial requirements also.
We want to first register our concern regarding the way the pre-2020 issues were dealt with in this session. In our view, the pre-2020 forms the good basis for the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And we remain concerned that this issue is not receiving the necessary attention. Having said that, we will go along with your decisions, both in the CMA and in the COP as the basic countries. But we strongly want to register the concern that we have regarding the way the pre-2020 issues continue to be addressed. And we would like this issue to be given a serious attention at the next session in Bonn. We know we are going to have the technical examination processes, and we expect them to be given sufficient time so that we can have good progress on these issues of pre-2020.
As always, finance proved to be a difficult area to negotiate. Climate finance is crucial for emissions mitigation and climate change adaptation. For this purpose, at COP15 in Copenhagen, rich countries pledged to give $100 billion per year to developing countries by 2020. As per the roadmap to $100 billion released by developed countries in October, 67% of the finance will come from public sources and the remainder will be mobilized from the private sector. Of this, only 20% of the money will go towards adaptation and the rest will address mitigation. This proved to be a controversial issue during the negotiations. Developed countries were not in favor of increasing the amount of adaptation finance. The limited amount left for adaptation jeopardizes the balance struck by the Paris Agreement between mitigation and adaptation. Insufficient adaptation finance is likely to have a debilitating impact on the vulnerable communities.
The roadmap says doubling, and a lot of developing countries say that's not enough, because what the roadmap currently shows, according to the way the developed countries have calculated, is there's 10 billion for adaptation. If you double that, you get to 20 billion by 2020. Given all projections we have about adaptation needs, and given that that would only be 20% of the 100 billion overall pie, 20 billion is simply inadequate. So a number of developing countries are trying to get strong language on the need that, you know, this doubling is certainly, you know, it's good to increase adaptation funding, but doubling is not enough. We need to scale it up much more aggressively.
Developing countries were skeptical about the mobilization of private finance because climate finance has, by and large, no commercial value and could fail to materialize. Developed countries also insisted on the acceptance of accounting methods which developing countries claimed were dubious. Interestingly, the official United Nations report on 2016 biennial assessment of climate finance flows also takes note of several inconsistencies in the data provided by the developed countries. Whether enough finance will flow to meet the objectives of the Paris Agreement remains to be seen.